War is only a cowardly escape from the problems of peace, because the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. Peace is such a difficult thing to maintain. You'd want it to be this permanent state that lasts forever, but sadly nothing in life is permanent, not even life. You would think that once you get peace, that's where the struggle ends, but that's not really the case ever. The truth is, conflict amongst people will always be present, and solving it is often the hardest part, especially amongst people who cannot find common ground or those who are never open to it. When you think about the ways to solve an issue with another party, the most caveman brain answer would be, well, there would be no conflict if that other party was just gone. But that involves war, and that's just not something you do in times of peace. But before we get into the philosophies of necessary wars, let's bring this back to One Piece. Today we'll be talking about conflict resolution within One Piece. Given the story is called One Piece, and we're following Luffy, who has been running around instigating justified wars, I wonder how all of this ends when Luffy finally brings about peace, if that ever happens. Oda actually gave us a lot of context in this avenue, and I'm hoping to connect you with some interesting line of thinking. So if you're new to my channel, the way I view the world is by making connections. So let me connect you to my vision, the ParVision. So let's start off talking about the state of the world in One Piece. We are in a time of peace, but is it real? I mean, the whole world is asking if we can get much higher, and if the One Piece is real. But how about we ask if the peace is real? Memes aside, we get this frustrating situation in the world where the governing forces in the world, rather than maintaining actual peace or attempting to, is more concerned in maintaining the illusion of peace. They have an agenda of balance that is beneficial to their own end, and anyone who even thinks of going in a direction that could break the balance, unbeknownst to them, will be slaughtered. This is an idea perpetuated by the Ohara incident, but also discussed more in depth in my Nolan Gorosei video. The illusion of peace is such an alluring concept because of what we talked about before. Maintaining peace is much harder than starting a war. Any mindless quackhead can start a war, and even win it depending on their parameters of victory. But peace? That's too hard. So the illusion of peace is appealing because you get the benefits of peace, but you maintain the balance using war tactics. I mean, the Gorosei committed a war crime on Ohara for the sake of peace. I would say this situation is the epitome of the illusion we're talking about. There was a difference of opinion, but the Gorosei solution was to not deal with the problem, and instead delete the instigating party. All that being said, within the One Piece world, we still have wars, several at that, and in previous videos we talked about how these wars are incentivized by the world government in the first place. They support nations that are providing heavenly tribute through whatever means possible for them. I mean, we saw Vodka Kingdom was literally pillaging and going to war with neighboring countries in order to provide heavenly tribute. The various oppressive entities so far in the story that have been made known to us have been overtaken by either the Straw Hats or the Revolutionary Army. But we have not seen all of the wars, and I've talked about the mass civil wars that probably took place in the Void Century in my Amatsuki video. With that in mind, after the Void Century, we were supposedly thrown in a sort of a stasis. The empty throne is supposed to be a symbol of peace. To quote what is exactly said here, it says, "You see, the kings of the various nations are on equal standing, and therefore they each make an oath to not seek control over the others. The 20 weapons that guard the throne were placed there as an oath by the first 20 who created this world 800 years ago. That throne is located at the very center of the world, and the fact that none sit upon it is a symbol of peace." So in this scene, because King Stelly was recently enthroned as King of Goa, he has to make an oath to not try to take control of other world government nations. Again, you can see the illusion of peace here. How do they intend to maintain the peace, and how do we know it's an illusion? Well, they maintain the peace through the Reverie, and we know it's an illusion because the very strong introduction we get to the Reverie in chapter 823. We start out saying the countries of the world are in a restless state due to an event that happens once every 4 years in the holy land of Merijua in the center of the world, the Reverie. Here, at the very highest of conferences, the monarchs of 50 nations will come together to discuss and debate the world's most serious topics and agree upon a shared direction to the future. But given the prudent and cantankerous natures of the most powerful of figures, the meetings are not always tranquil. There were so many things within those lines alone that I want to dive into, and we'll get into them in a little bit. But first, I want to add some more context we get from Garp in chapter 956. While talking to King Neptune after returning from the Reverie, Garp says, "The Reverie always seems to result in chaos. You've got 50 heads of state together in one place. Do you think they're going to get along? Each of them has internal trouble on their plate. The greater powers silently stare each other down while urging their smaller allies into fights using resources and tools as leverage. Differences in wealth and religion will ensure that kings are never truly equals. When it comes time to join hands, they smile and grind each other's boots under the table. How many kings can actually speak equally for both their own people and others?" And Garp continues to say, "As long as no blood is spilled, I'm willing to call it peace." And there we go. Is that not quite literally the illusion of peace? If no blood is spilled, I guess it's not war, but can you really call this sad state of affairs peace? When the leaders are representing their own people and come from such different backgrounds, how can they find common ground? They all forget that people are people, and everyone should be treated equally, but even our world forgets that one. And that's what's really interesting here, right? Doesn't the Reverie very easily parallel the UN from our world? Without talking about specifics, so the video doesn't randomly get shadow banned, but the greater powers silently stare each other down while urging their smaller allies into fights. Didn't that happen earlier this year with world powers? But also, isn't that the state of the world for nearly the entirety of my lifetime? To avoid two world powers clashing, there are several tactics in place to avoid that situation. I mean, accumulating nuclear powers, which could be equated to ancient weapons in One Piece, is a definitive preventative measure for a large-scale war. Just like you wouldn't push the buttons of a nuclear nation, you probably wouldn't push the buttons of a nation that had Poseidon, for example. Call back to my Otahime video. I mean, if we take a step back, I think a majority of us can understand, yeah, the UN has good intentions for being what it is, but are they truly effective in reaching their goals? The relative independent nations' agendas come into conflict, which is exactly what is described here in One Piece. Each nation has internal trouble on their plate, which frames their perspective in these discussions. With that in mind, even the Gorosei have their own agendas when it comes to the Reverie, which, if the most powerful entity present has an agenda and wants to push the illusion of peace, then there's no ground for any of this to stand on. I mean, the empty throne is not empty for starters, but without talking about Im just yet, let's talk about the Reverie and its traditions. So the Reverie was a system for conflict resolution for the One Piece world, definitely akin to the UN. The UN was formed after World War II, where a nuclear weapon was used in Japan, and the Reverie was formed after the Void Century, which we assume to contain some kind of massive war, where ancient weapons were supposedly used. I imagine, for example, Pluton was used at least once. It is said to be able to vaporize an entire island, and that kind of sounds like a nuke. So since in real history it was used on Japan, maybe it was used in Wano in the One Piece world. If you string a few of the currently prevailing Pluton theories together, you could probably get a result like this. But anyways, if the Reverie is the way the One Piece world resolves conflicts, and it's similar to the UN, maybe there's some other similarities when we're looking at peace resolution. That's when Hidden Island's Rome Peace video hit me, which, by the way, him and I are working on a part 2 for that video and relates to his overall mega theory about the One Piece. So anyways, I was thinking how odd the Reverie's frequency was. It's so weird. One of the details we learned was that since the Void Century, there has been 200 Reveries, because they happen every 4 years, which is something again we dived into in the Nolan video, where the Reverie that took place in his time was the 100th Reverie. But yeah, if they wanted to do conflict resolution, why not meet more frequently? It's almost like they care more about the illusion of peace again. Or maybe they were replacing something. That's when I laughed a little, because technically there was a form of conflict resolution before the UN, and that was the Olympics. Ironically, the modern Olympics started in 1894, which was just before the onset of the World Wars. But there was some specifics included in the Olympics that was done because of a tradition, and that was the Olympic truce. The truce that Russia has technically been breaking, which disqualified them for the recent Olympics. It's that basic basically, none of the participating countries would be involved in a war. It's something that has been largely respected, except for some obvious situations. And obviously the Olympics are held every 4 years. The thing about the Olympic truce is that it originated from the ancient Olympic tradition, that when the Olympic Games were held in honor of Zeus, there would essentially be a decree that would spread throughout the land that would hold a ceasefire of some sort. Obviously, it wasn't as ironclad as it could be, but at the minimum, it would have protected travelers and participants that were traveling for the sake of the Olympic Games. Now, the Olympics are really interesting for so many reasons. I mean, already a Greek-inspired tradition predating the Reverie would make sense because the ancient weapons are also named after the Greek gods and deities that were supposed to be active before and during the Void Century. The Olympics' origins aren't exactly perfectly known, but there's a bunch of really interesting details that I would love to run through. The first recorded Olympian was actually a cook named Korobois. These Olympics were said to have been started by Pelops, a legendary figure that was touted for several reasons, and some details I'll share towards the end. Another telling of the Olympics backstory is that Heracles, son of Zeus, started the Olympics, which is interesting because we do have a character in One Piece named Heracles, with a mysterious background. The ancient Olympics were typically known for the great sporting events that took place, but another really important detail and often overlooked is that the Olympics served as a central gathering like no other, honestly, in history. Even if you weren't an athlete or even a spectator, you wanted to go to the Olympic Games. Political officials were obligated to go as ambassadors, but also if you were a cook, a musician, magician, doctor, merchant, inventor, philosopher, explorer, whatever it was, you wanted to be there because it was a great gathering that attracted the best of the best. To make a name for yourself, it was imperative that you went, because it was the best place to be at. It was described as a giant party with grand festivities as well. And again, keep in mind, normally if nations or city-states were at odds, it would make it difficult and dangerous to travel. But because of the Olympic truce, it was easier for people to make it to these events. But even more than how the Olympics started is how the Olympics ended. So we know the Olympics were to be done in the honor of Zeus, Apollo, and Poseidon. Poseidon, which we know as the god of the sea, but also as god of horses and earthquakes. But in any case, the ancient Olympics were known to be the birthplace of heroes and legends, done in the land of the gods. That's where we get some really interesting One Piece connections. But before that, let's talk about how the ancient Olympics ended. The Greeks held the Olympics, but towards the fall of Greece and the rise of Rome, or rather the dawn of Rome, or maybe better yet, the Romans' dawn, we see the decline of the Olympic Games. For lack of better words, the Romans were kind of lame, no offense. The Romans always looked at the Olympic Games as an opportunity for political gain, rather than what it was originally intended for. And so here's a funny story. Apparently there was an Emperor Nero who was such a sore loser that he participated and declared himself the winner despite not actually winning and instead having fallen off of his horse in the chariot race. In general, even with the normal operations of the Olympic Games, that was cheating. But there was also heavy oversight, but nothing like that of Emperor Nero from my understanding. Thereafter, several tragedies took place, and Theodosius I, through some form of decision-making, declared the Olympics essentially illegal. He banned all pagan festivities, and I believe with that, many of the arts associated with it that praise the polytheistic gods of the past. Again, it sounds kind of similar to how the world government just seems so anti-fun. I mean, again, the Rumbar Pirates were a sailing group of musicians that were declared criminals. In a lot of ways, the world government in One Piece seems to be anti-travel unless it's under their umbrella, which sounds similar to the Rome situation here with the Olympics. But okay, now that I painted a decent picture of how the Reverie was a conflict resolution system that was similar to the UN, maybe the 4-year frequency is supposed to relate to the Olympic game tradition, and various aspects running from the Olympics to the UN mirrors aspects in the show One Piece, and that's where I think we hit the note. Within One Piece, we actually have something that would fit the description of the Olympic Games, and it might be that this system was how the One Piece world mediated conflicts prior to the onset of the world government and the Reverie. By now, you probably already know where I'm getting at. And yes, the answer is the Davy back fights. Think about it. To mediate conflicts during the Davy back fights, both parties entered into a relative truce and agreed to not fight each other outside of the games. The Davy back fights were regarded as a pirate game. In other words, an outlawed game. If the D-Clan or Ancient Kingdom were declared pirates, then maybe the Davy back fights originated from then, cementing the idea that the Ancient Kingdom with the Greek ancient weapons could have been even more associated with the Greeks and Romans than we realize. Something about the poneglyphs that could be interesting to note is that we don't get to read all of them. But what if some of the poneglyphs were game records of the Davy back fights? I was thinking, what if part of the history that the world government wants to hide is an embarrassing loss that they incurred, similar to that of Emperor Nero? It would be the laugh tale that could have made Roger laugh, and something the world government, especially with everything else in mind, would probably want to hide. It could be that the Davy back fights were held every 4 years like the Olympics and were held by the Ancient Kingdom. Sun God Nika may have simply been a hero born out of these games, dubbed the Warrior of Liberation. That's not to say Nika didn't actually liberate populations, but more so that might be where the epithet of Sun God was given. The Olympics were held for Mount Olympus, the land of gods. Maybe Davy back fights were done in some relation to the Lunarians who resided in the land of gods. It may even be that the way the Lunarians' land was taken from them was through some absurd Davy back fight trade where the world government cheated in such an embarrassing way that they decided to wipe the history books. When we were shown the Davy back fight happening in the Foxy arc, we see that even in the conflict with the Foxy pirates, the Straw Hats are taking in the peace and enjoying the festivities. The Foxy pirates, though the villains of the arc, were holding what looks like to me to be a really fun and lighthearted carnival and festival, with music, foods, shops, and who knows what else would be at something like this. They even had fireworks too. So you could imagine how grand this might have been if held by the Ancient Kingdom. This event was probably originally a giant celebratory party that was meant to gather the entire world to enjoy peace together and acclimate themselves to being more friendly towards each other. Maybe Joy Boy was the man who started these events, similar to Pelops, and maybe the title of Joy Boy or Gods was given to the winner of these Davy back fights. Maybe the trading crewmates tradition was more so intended to bring about a sort of friendly way to enact migration. Or it could be that this tradition was a part of the last Davy back games that resulted in Pluton or Uranus being traded to the world government side, and ultimately resulting in a deadly situation because these powerful entities were used as weapons in the wrong hands. So if you were on the fence about the Davy back fights being important and whether it'd happen again in the future, I think because of these connections, I think we will definitely be getting some better understanding of them in the future. It might be that these games were a vital part of the Void Century also. In the next video, I'll talk about a possible cool idea that brings relevance to the Davy back fights in our current time in the One Piece world. And so another small but fun detail is that when the Reverie was introduced to us, the next image is of the King of Eleusia, which could be a reference to Elis, which was home to many important Olympians, including the first recorded Olympian. Maybe that's a stretch, but guess who the King of Eleusia is? It's currently King Caesar. Is that not a very deliberate reference to Rome? So the Reverie being connected to Rome seems like something even Oda wants to hint at. There's so many other connections with Rome and Greece that I'll get into another time with the Hidden Island for a future Rome Piece Part 2. Because if this is the case of the Davy back fights, then that gives greater importance to not just the Davy back fights, but maybe the Davy back fights that we know of are not the original ones, just like how the modern Olympics and ancient Olympics differed. For example, the original Olympic Games, though had a variety of games, the most notable one was just a race. A funny idea that I had was maybe the racing around the planet was one of the games. Someone ran the red line and the other person sailed the grand line, and the red line was the finish line essentially. It was just an interesting thought that might make it make sense as to why Roger needed to circumnavigate the globe to become the Pirate King. But also, if the Davy back fights are this important, then I think the Rocks family and Pirate Island are going to become even more important for understanding the Void Century. And that's where I'll end today's video because I got so much to say for the Void Century and Shanks and hockey. Sorry, I've been less active on my own channel recently. If you've come to my Twitch streams, then you know some of the reasons why. All that being said, I'm so grateful for all of you who watch these videos. If you want to help support me getting more videos out, help me out on the algorithm by liking, sharing, sharing, and subscribing. And a special shout out to the visionaries, patrons, and Twitch subs who have been supporting the channel. All of the help really does make an impact in making the channel more sustainable for me to maintain. And so if you haven't heard yet, I am reviving the ParVision merch line. The Visionary Pirates Jolly Roger shirt and Par's Pillow Talk Theory pillow is available now on my store. And congrats to Dak Sake and Toss Morn for winning the Discord giveaway earlier this week. Other than that, thank you for being here, and I'm looking forward to the next time. And so, like always, thank you for connecting with me, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all on the next ParVision.